This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.
Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with us tonight Dr. Buck Melton. Welcome, Buck.
Glad to be here. Got a bit of a head cold today.
Oh, good.
So
okay. Well, I'll be careful. It's
it's
the season for flu, I guess you'd say. Well, we've had lots of conversations tonight. Maybe we can discuss dual citizenship, since that seems to be an issue that's surfacing in the American political contest. And there's a lot of attention to that. Who is a citizen? What's a dual citizen? And I think this boils down to also the way the Constitution describes who can be the president.
Yes.
You'd have to be a natural, as I understand this, a natural-born
citizen.
Now that means just the old-fashioned way being born. I mean, or is it
yes,
some other way?
No in vitro fertilization. No cesarean section. No from his mother's womb unkindly.
Could you discuss that? What exactly that means? I understand there's a lot of sort of legal scholarship devoted to parsing that out.
Well, I think before we even get to the natural-born citizen requirement, we need to talk about citizenship in general under just general law.
Yes,
and
I think that would be a useful thing.
And generally speaking, there are two ways to gain citizenship in the world. And one way is called in Latin, because we love to put things in Latin, the jus soli, which means the law of the soil, and the other is the jus sanguinis, the law of the blood.
Yes.
And the former, law of the soil, means that your citizenship is determined by whether or not you were born within the country, within the realm.
Yes.
And if you're born there, that gives you citizenship. And jus sanguinis, it's not where you're born, but who you're born to, who your parents are.
Yes.
So the United States, generally speaking, observes the jus soli, the law of the soil.
Yes.
And this has probably been the case ever since the founding, the writing of the Constitution in 1787. It has certainly been the case since 1868, when we ratified the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment states very clearly, very plainly, if you are born in the United States and subject to its jurisdiction, you're a citizen of the United States.
Now, around the world, that might not be so much the case, as I understand it. So that might actually be a bit of an exception, if I can understand this.
Yeah, it's very interesting, because in the old world, in Europe, for instance, the rule would be by blood, sanguinis.
Yes.
It's very interesting that almost all of the countries that have adopted jus soli are in the New World. They're, if you're thinking about it, the Monroe Doctrine, they're distancing themselves from the old ways and kingship and inherited titles.
Yes.
And so citizenship depends more about not what your blood is, but whether or not you have been exposed to the right ideas, whether or not you have bought into the American civil religion or the idea of republicanism. So yeah, I think that's
so. You could be born, if I can understand this, and maybe we can get into some of the quandaries about who can run for president here.
Yes.
But presumably, the way the American law functions, if you're in an airport, you happen to be pregnant, you're in an airport, you deliver the child on the runway.
Yes.
The child stays here just 12 hours. The plane takes off again and goes back to your native. Let's say Russia. You go back to. You go back to Moscow, and the person grows up in Moscow to Russian parents, but the fact that this person was on the runway, the tarmac, when they entered the earth, and does that give that person American citizenship's right in perpetuity? And let's suppose the person grows up to be the head of the Soviet, or of Russia, becomes the premier of Russia, and is a tremendous, I guess in some ways, as an antipathy for the U.S. in some fashion.
Yes.
and yet is a U.S. citizen. Is that possible? Can that system, can that happen? Is that what goes on here?
Within limits, yes. This is the much vaunted birthright citizenship that we're talking about, and that goes back to the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment was written, this clause of the 14th Amendment was written specifically to address former slaves, African Americans. In the infamous Dred Scott decision of 1857, the Supreme Court said, and the quotation was literally, the black man has no rights that the white man is bound to respect. They are not citizens, they can't be citizens. And so the 14th Amendment said, we are hereby overruling Dred Scott. If you are born here, regardless of color, regardless of anything else, and you are subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, that is, you're not born to foreign diplomats, then you are a citizen.
In perpetuity.
You can, if you never stay here, then it's quite possible that you can do something to have forfeited that or to have shown allegiance to another country. Probably one of the more famous examples of that came up in the Hamdi decision before the Supreme Court about 10 years ago, when Hamdi, who was an Al-Qaeda fighter, I believe, he'd been captured, he'd been shipped to Guantanamo. It turns out that Hamdi had, I believe, been born in the United States. He had never spent any time here, but he'd been born, so he technically had birthright citizenship. And Hamdi claimed, you can't treat me like this. As an American citizen, I have certain rights. So this sort of thing comes up now and then.
Well, what happened to that? Do you happen to know what happened?
You know, I'm drawing a blank on that, which is terrible for a constitutional scholar to say. So.
Well, I mean, so what I'm sort of settling the ship, at least as for this part of our conversation, is the idea of divided loyalty. So, and as I understand, it can cause substantial confusion, and maybe it's something we need to think about as the world grows smaller. There are many people have a right to additional citizenship. So, for instance, you mentioned, I won't use the Latin term, but the idea of blood, citizenship by blood. So my understanding is that many people of my acquaintance will say, well, you know, my grandfather was born in Ireland, or my great-grandmother in Sweden, or wherever, and I've decided to become dual citizen. And I'm just going to get a passport, and when I go through the airport, I can go through the, whatever, the European Union line and whatever. And it seems to be something going on like that that is in some ways antithetical to the idea of the nation state or some kind of rigid group of people with loyalty to only one kind of government. So if you have many different citizenships, doesn't that create some kind of peril in a way? And if there are cases out there where a person could have U.S. citizenship and actually be a devout enemy of the state and do everything that person could to injure the country and still have a U.S. citizenship. It seems a little bit unusual.
Well, under congressional law and Congress, long before the 14th Amendment was passed, from the very beginning, Congress had the power to set naturalization rules. And also, there's a very strong argument that Congress has the inherent power within the limits of the Constitution to decide who is and who is not a citizen. So there are many circumstances when Congress has said that someone can lose his American citizenship by certain acts. So, for instance, Congress extended, to a small degree, adopted jus sanguinis. It says that Congress has said if you are born to American citizens, but you are born abroad, or to at least one American citizen, and you are born abroad, you are still an American citizen, provided certain things take place. Provided, for instance, your citizen parent has lived within a certain amount of time in the United States, provided you yourself live within the United States for a certain period of time. But if you don't meet these conditions, you can lose that citizenship. So I think what I'm getting at here is that the whole idea of the law of the soil, used solely, defines Americans not by their blood, but by their belief, if you will, by their allegiance to not just the United States, but to the American way of thinking, what I might tritely call truth, justice, and the American way. And if they do something that shows they don't have that kind of allegiance, they can lose their citizenship.
Now, just to talk
Yes.
about it, my understanding is about 16% of the population, a huge relative percentage.
Yes.
We've had big percentages of foreign-born people in the country in the past. I think
Yes.
particularly 1920 or so, 1910. But recently, there's a huge number of people have become naturalized citizens. And they do, as I understand it, it's not necessary to renounce their own citizenship.
Mm-hmm.
So particularly in the American Southwest, where you have dual Mexican
Yes,
U.S.
yes.
citizens going back and forth, it would appear to me that that's sort of weakening, if you want to use it that
Yes.
way. Maybe that's the correct thing.
I think
maybe
it is.
that's all right for that to happen. But you have the natural kind of boundary is very blurry.
Yes.
If you're voting in both elections, and it's a very nebulous kind of thing. And the U.S. presently, the situation is, I think, that you're allowed to be citizenship of anywhere. You can have 5 different passports. The U.S. makes no restriction on citizenship. There doesn't seem to be any particular, I guess, duty, to use that phrase. If
Yes.
if you're an American citizen, do you have any particular duty? For instance, what happens? Are you draftable if you're in whatever, or can someone, I guess, put you in the U.S. justice system? We demand this or that, or it's very unusual, isn't it? And so we have a
Yes.
system where we literally have millions of people that are naturalized citizens, and presumably they have their children with the so-called anchor baby situation.
Yes.
So their families have a right to be here, and which I'm not saying any of this is. I'm not passing judgment on it, but it does appear that the idea of being a U.S. citizenship and having a solitary obligation to the flag
Yes.
and to the whatever America is extremely blurry.
Yes.
Referable to the idea of citizenship.
Yes, there are a couple of narrow points, and then there's a larger point that I think you're getting at. The narrow points, first of all, the problem of policing. When you're dealing with this mobile population going back and forth between borders, how do you really know what this person is doing when he's not within the United States, or even when he is? And secondly, it's the matter of the reach of the law. That the United States is good at enforcing its own laws within its own borders, but it can't really impose its law on someone who holds a foreign passport when that someone is not within the United States. So once he gets here, you could take his passport or conscript him or put him in jail, but once he's back in Mexico or Honduras or Germany or wherever he's from, you don't have a lot of reach there.
Now, there are many. I mean, you mentioned the Al Qaeda case,
Yes.
and I don't. One can wonder how that turned out. But what happens if you take up arms? You're an American. You were here briefly. You're on that tarmac,
Yes.
and you can pick whatever war you were in. I mean, you could say you were in the Luftwaffe after
Yes,
this.
yes.
You were born. You went, which is a number of people that happened
Yes.
to.
Yes.
You're now flying for the Luftwaffe, and you're dropping bombs, and you're shot down, and you're captured.
Yes.
Would that person be tried for treason and executed?
Well, generally speaking, you're opening up a big can of worms there, but generally speaking, taking up arms against the United States is one of the classic ways you get of losing your citizenship. Treason, interestingly enough, at least according to some lines of thought, can be committed by a foreign national. And there's some interesting legal theories as to why that should be, so that doesn't enter into it. If I could look at the more general picture, though, look at some of the big issues regarding citizenship that have come up in the past 8 to 10 years. You have Barack Obama, our president, who has a Kenyan father, who is accused by the birther movement of not being a United States citizen. More recently, you have Ted Cruz, who is now being charged with the possibility of not being a natural-born citizen.
Yes.
You have the immigrant question that you've brought up, and
Yes.
I think one reason why people are concerned with the illegal immigrant issue is the exact reason you've brought up, the question of divided loyalty, or perhaps a lack of loyalty, lack of buying into that American ideal. More recently still, you have the question of Syrian refugees,
Yes.
and do they have a right to come here, whether citizens or not. And the common thing circulating through all these is, in this new globalized world and
Yes.
ease of travel, what makes an American? What is this thing that qualifies you to be able to say I'm an American citizen or I'm a natural born citizen. It seems to be belief. It always seems to have been an unspoken rule that you believe in the system.
Yes.
And now, because of the mobile population, we can no longer take for granted that people do accept that. And so that's why all these questions are coming up and are becoming very hot button issues.
Well, it's a rather difficult story. I mean, I was thinking about, well, let's see, we could talk about President Obama, or we could talk about Senator Cruz. Each of those people, presumably, had the right. They were true enough. You could say that President Obama, whether or not he was born I'm sure he was born in Hawaii,
yes.
but okay, but besides that, there was no question that his mother was an American citizen.
Yes, which brings us to that natural born issue you led off with.
And so one of the things going on here is the way the courts are trying to parse their way. I believe, in general, they're always going to expand the idea of citizenship. It'd be very unusual for the courts to ever say we're going to restrict citizenship. It's passed out pretty easily, and there's not a sense of restriction. But are the courts now saying pretty much that you can become an American citizen either by having been on the tarmac, or you can become an American citizen by one family member, presumably either the mother or the father was an American citizen, which brings up the issue of what happens if you're an illegitimate child from a bordello in Saigon or whatever.
Yes.
I mean, and you have all those issues. And then you also have the possibility of being naturalized so there are many pathways, and the courts are opening that quite widely.
Yes.
Now, there is the restriction in the Constitution saying you must be naturally born.
Yes.
Now, is that going, those three ways I threw out that you might become an American citizen, there's a restriction going down to what?
Yes. Well, the three things, born soulless, on the soil,
Right.
Born to blood, or naturalized.
Right.
Clearly not a citizen to begin with, but takes an oath of allegiance
Correct.
and this sort of thing, buys into the civil religion.
Right.
Natural born citizen appears only in the clause regarding presidential qualifications. You must be a natural born citizen. Now, in the common law, the British common law up to that point, probably the better argument is that you are born within the realm. You're born on the soil.
Yes.
And if you look at the early naturalization laws, the Naturalization Act passed by Congress in 1790 said that if you are born on foreign soil, but you are born to American parents, then, and here's the fun part, you shall be considered as being natural born.
Right.
It doesn't say that you shall be natural born. I mean, you will be considered as. So a lot of the evidence points to the idea that you've got to be born on American territory, which Ted Cruz was not.
Yes.
To bring that issue up. So,
that's at least one way. So, do you believe this situation has been suggested this be litigated before the presidential election? It'd be a terrible situation if there was some kind of constitutional cloud over Senator Cruz were he to become the president. I mean, and any comments on that?
Yes.
I mean, is this something you could get a quick judgment on if you had to?
Well, if you go with my theory of citizenship is determined, and this is not a legal determination, of course, but citizenship is determined by your allegiance to truth, justice, and the American way.
Right.
I think Cruz seems to fit within that. I mean, I think most American politicians would. But I think this is going to become more of an issue as the decades roll on and not less of an issue. So for clarity's sake, it's something that probably needs to be sorted out now in light of the current question we face and the current problems regarding citizenship and divided loyalty. And the time to do that is before he gets put on that ballot.
Well, all right, I might take a slightly opposing view. I mean, just if considered as opposed to shall be, considered and shall, to me, seem pretty close. And shall almost seems to be rewriting something, and considered means, okay, we accept it. I mean, I would say if Congress is the interpreter.
But is it?
That's a good question. And I think there's some place in the Constitution that says somewhere that Congress has some say in how naturalization occurs. Am I wrong on that?
That is correct. But the question is, if Congress passed a law saying green shall be considered as blue,
yes.
The question is, has Congress exceeded its constitutional authority by doing that?
Well, can I say they often do that, if you wanted to say that. I mean,
one of my
that's not an uncommon thing.
Yes. One of my favorite Supreme Court cases is the case of Nix versus Hedden, which I believe was 1893. And I always cite this in my classes to show how fun interpretation can be. I point out that this was the most important case in Supreme Court history. The court was called upon to decide the momentous, earth-shattering question of whether a tomato is a fruit or a vegetable.
Yes.
Because Congress had put a tariff on vegetables, and a tomato importer said, well, tomato, of course, is a fruit, because botanically it is a fruit. Would you like to, I do know the answer to this one, would you like to wager how the Supreme Court decided?
I would call it a vegetable.
The Supreme Court came down and said, the botanists and scientists are all wrong. It's a vegetable because we eat it like a vegetable.
It's a common parlance would be what I would go with. The intent of Congress was using the common parlance as opposed to something past their intellectual abilities.
Yes.
Well, now, just to get into this, I mean, it's sort of a divided loyalty story here. Let's go back to the American Revolution. Everyone presumably was born as a subject of the king at that point, and they were not born in England, but the idea that blood made them, if I can say what I'm kind of getting into the idea, is that it's a little more complicated in the 17th century. There might have been two pathways to become an Englishman, to say that. You could be an Englishman being born in Boston as well as you could in whatever. And the idea that these British citizens did not have, a say in Parliament. There's a lot of issues about, maybe that's one of the things that caused some confusion in the 18th century on this issue. So you had all of these English citizens, British citizens here. They were subject to the king and presumably could be hung or as traitors.
Yes.
So you hang George Washington, or whatever. That was everyone's danger there. But then when the American Revolution was successful, people did not arbitrarily reject their citizenship as English people, but were they still, you have, in some ways, that generation, they were all basically dual citizens. That existed, everybody was a dual citizen because they did not exactly reject that. And so people that would go, I'd say in 1790s, they would somehow go to England, they'd show up, they could say basically, I'm an Englishman here, even though I'm from America, I have not renounced my citizenship. And what happened was, just to talk about how this issue gets confused, in the War of 1812, one of the big reasons that happened, the war had the impressment.
Yes.
So you had these ships sailing around, and there might have been a person on the ship that was from Boston that had been born, pick your year, 1780.
Yes.
Well,
we'll make it 1770.
Right, okay, it was 42 years old. Well, okay, 42 years old on the ship. Okay, you're English, and we're going to demand you do this. And so this, I think that notion of how these divided loyalties plays itself out, and there's a certain naivete about, okay, I'm an American, I know what I am, I know what the identity is, and the confusion of the time and circumstances means often that this has been the case.
Yes.
Is that correct?
That is true. And adding to that, and England said, made no bones about it, you have not renounced your British citizenship, and therefore you are subject to being pressed into His Majesty's Navy. And also the fact that passports were not widely in use back then.
Right.
Interestingly enough, passports really came into wide-scale use for the average citizen, if I may say, as a result of World War I and questions, once again, of divided loyalties. And can we trust this person? No, we're going to have to police our borders and our population by issuing passports showing these people are in good standing with our government.
Yes. Now, just to continue discussing this, we could keep going with it, but one of the things that happened was in the American Civil War, okay, so the state of Georgia says, now you have a new country, you have a new passport. But people did not, and we had many families who were divided or whatever.
Yes.
So you're a dual citizen of the Confederacy and the U.S. So presumably everyone, at least in this era, not everyone, but there was a situation where this divided loyalty, who do you support, who do you not support, and you have the right to be either.
I would have to modify that a little bit. I don't think any Confederate would say that he was a citizen of the United States, and I don't think that anyone in the Union based on the Union argument, would say that a Confederate States of America even existed to have allegiance to. I think what you would see is that you have somebody who is a citizen of the state of Georgia and a citizen of the United States, and that this may lead to some sort of conflict between the two.
Well, I guess the point I'm making is that you can have a sense of identity confusion, and that
Yes.
people often have the idea, well, I'm part of both places, and it's hard to say, you know, where my true allegiance lies, particularly when these countries are in conflict.
Yes.
And just to keep going with this, one of the things that occurred, which is well known as the black mark on America, was when all those Japanese American citizens were placed
citizens
sent
by
to
birth
Wyoming.
in many cases.
However, those people, you know, many of them were considered dual citizens. So you
Yes.
had a dual citizenship. You can imagine the situation you're in, and a fair number of people, some number, I can't give you the exact number, but some people that had dual citizenships fought for Japan.
Yes.
So there's a sense of divided loyalty there,
Yes.
and also for Germany. So you had dual citizenship that would say, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, and sort of what I'm getting into is the case where people that were dual citizens for Germany, they came in and they tried to blow things up,
Yes.
you know, and
The
they were,
quitting case,
they were
yes.
executed as traitors.
Yes.
But they could have well said, well, look, I want to renounce, I can go either way I want on this. I have two passports.
Yes. Well, Quidden and his people, these were the German saboteurs, actually tried to argue, very much as Hamdi did 70 years later,
yes.
that we are American nationals and you know, we get these rights.
Yes.
And the Supreme Court said, no, you don't. In that case, I do know the answer. The
Yes,
Supreme
right,
Court
right,
said, no,
right,
you
right,
don't.
right.
So they were court-martialed, tried in military commissions, sentenced to death, not reviewed by the civilian courts, and in fact executed.
Yes. So I guess what I'm sort of getting into here, as we get to the end of our conversation, is some of the tension in the world that we have, some of the sort of sense of disturbance, particularly with Al Qaeda, and the idea that people that are, I don't know, maybe they have U.S. passports, they're going overseas, they're coming back. I think it's particularly true in Europe, and the issues that are taking place with in Northern Europe, where the millions of people are coming in that are getting citizenship in a country like Sweden or a country like Germany, that are really in some ways alien to their history and social circumstances. And this seems to be one of the things that's happening in the world, happening more and more in the 21st century. And the resolution of these conflicted loyalties, I mean, I don't know if the courts have kept up with that, or that Americans understand really what's happening when so many passports are issued.
Yes. Well, this is part of the larger movement that you have seen in the Republican Party, especially in the last 20 years. Globalization, free trade, dropping of all trade barriers, increasing transportation, increasing diversity, cultural diversity, ethnic diversity, borders break down, and yet we have still have these requirements like natural-born citizen that have this embarrassing way of still being legally important, and they're coming into conflict with the new way of thinking and the new world order. And so we get questions like, is Ted Cruz qualified constitutionally to be president? Is Barack Obama qualified constitutionally to be president? We will see this. It's not going away. You're going to see this happening more and more and more as time passes.
It would be interesting to plot out in the world. I mean, the number of, I don't know, we have 8 billion people, or 7 billion maybe on the planet. With the increase, or maybe I'm overstating this, at least in the West, in prosperous countries that have porous borders, particularly Western Europe and the U.S., maybe Canada, maybe Australia, sort of porous borders, the percentage of people that are holding multiple passports, and it does seem to weaken in my opinion, it weakens national identity.
It does.
There was a time, as I understand it, that Congress said that if you're going to become an American citizen, you're going to have to renounce every other, you have every other sovereignty as being renounced.
Yes, very
so,
good. So is citizenship passé?
Yes. All right, on that note, thank you, Bucky. Have a good interchange tonight. Thank you.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.